Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuhu. I'd like to welcome you to the fourth in a five-part series. The series is about challenges for Muslims in the 15th and 21st century. It's a very, very important conversation that I believe that Muslims should have worldwide. And I'm hoping that this series will spark that conversation amongst Muslims, number one, in terms of the obligations that we have in terms of leadership. Secondly, I'm hoping that what I've been saying in the past three sessions, and this session as well, will illuminate and clarify some of the issues that non-Muslims might have in understanding Islam, particularly in relationship to the issue of leadership and whether a person is doing it just to learn about Islam, to live in community with us, or somebody who's considering taking Shahada, that is saying La ilaha illallah, Muhammadan Rasulullah, and becoming a part of the worldwide community of Muhammad. I hope it's beneficial to you. The last point is that we were hoping that you've got from our last segment is that where there is a model that Muslims have of leadership in the 15th and the 21st century, and that's the model of what we call the prophetic paradigm of Prophet Muhammad, peace and blessings be upon him. That model included taking a look at the difference between power, authority, and leadership, which we did in the last segment. That model included a foundational base for the model that included devotion to Allah and His Messenger, peace be upon him, which meant loving and obeying Allah and His Messenger. It also meant discipline that came from inside the person who would be leader, that he or she should be self-disciplined, because this is the kind of role model that you want in front of the people, not somebody who cannot control him or herself. The third is a person who is into development, educational development, that is, and we focused on two parts of that. First, the acquisition of knowledge, which is a hallmark of the Muslim faith, that we should strive to learn from cradle to the grave, as it were, and there's great benefits in making sure that our children, particularly our daughters, are educated. And then the implementation of that knowledge, because knowledge without implementation has no benefit. We can see from looking at our last segment that the Muslims have a particular form of leadership, which we've chosen to call Muslim leadership, that includes devotion, that includes discipline, that includes development, and it's one that we hope that Muslims would implement and the non-Muslims would understand as our way of being. We're now in the fourth segment of our five-part series, and as we promised the last time, it will be focused on the post-victimization ethical exemption syndrome. You probably have never heard of such a thing. I call it the PVEE syndrome. You probably never heard of such a thing. It's something I developed in terms of thinking about how Muslims are having difficulty in providing effective leadership. We're going to talk about this in a moment, but what we'd like to do is first to set a little bit of context for talking about the PV syndrome. There's a verse in the Quran in Surah Ma'idah, and the verse pretty much goes, "O you who believe, stand out firmly for justice and witness for fair dealing, and don't let the hatred of others towards you cause you to swerve from justice. Be just." That's closer to piety. This is more or less the meaning of this particular verse in the chapter called Ma'idah. This is the fifth chapter and the 8th verse. Now, the thing to understand in terms of the context for this particular chapter is, first of all, that it is aimed specifically at the Muslims. It begins in Arabic, Ya ayyuhalladhina amanu, O those of you who believe. And so there are also verses in the Quran that are directed at the non-Muslims. Ya ayyuhan nas is directed at the non-Muslims, but this is directed particularly at the Muslims. And it calls the Muslims to justice, right? It says, so stand out firmly for justice, right? In other places in the Quran, this model of justice has a very high mark. In other words, it's not just be just with people who are just with you, or be just with people who are in your family, or be just with people who are in your inner circle, or be just with people that you like, but it's a standard of justice that we find in Surah An-Nisa, and the essence of it is stand out firmly for justice as witnesses to fair dealing against yourself. To be just against yourself is a pretty high standard. Against your parents, that's a high standard. How many of us would be just if it involved our parents? Against your kin, our blood relatives or our relatives by marriage, and against rich or poor. Sometimes we are unjust by supporting the poor or the downtrodden simply because we feel that we need to protect them. Even if they've done an injustice, we won't speak out against it. And what's said in Surah 4, 135, is that God is the better able to protect these kinds of people, and that we should have this kind of worldview. And back to Ma'idah 5:8, Surah 5, number 8, we find that Allah ends that ayah, ends that verse in the Quran with the admonition that this kind of justice is closer to piety. Remember what we said about devotion the last time, and this is the kind of thing that we're talking about: loving and obeying Allah and His Messenger. And if you love and obey Allah and His Messenger, you're going to be one who's going to be just. And the reason why I'm talking about this in the context of the PV syndrome is that I find, as I travel throughout the Muslim world, and as I travel amongst people who are not Muslims, that people swerve from justice because of what I call the PV syndrome, the post-victimization ethical exemption syndrome. That is to say that people feel, because of a situation that's happened within their particular community, they're exempt from the standard of justice that they are normally required to follow. Remember, we're talking about leadership here. We're talking about the challenges that face leadership in the 15th and 21st century, and that in a situation where many Muslim countries are coming out of post-colonial situations, in a situation where some Muslim countries have been invaded by others, some Muslims are occupied by others, it's very, very tempting, extremely, extremely tempting to lower the standard of justice. In addition, we'll find ourselves where I live in the United States of America, when we're surrounded by people who might not be honest, we're surrounded by people who might be corrupt, we're surrounded by people who don't tell the truth, we're surrounded by people who double deal. We might be inclined, given our situation, because lots of times those people don't tell the truth, they double deal, in the service of being against the Muslims. We're surrounded by these people. We're tempted to lower our standards of justice. And what I want to say about this is that my understanding of these two verses that we recited, I'm not a person who's qualified to make commentary on the Quran. I'm not a person who's qualified to give exegesis of the Quran. I'm not a mufassir. I can't make tafsir or give adequate commentary on the Quran. So therefore, you shouldn't take it from me. You should take it from a person of knowledge. But my meager understanding of the verses that we talked about, the one in Ma'idah and the one in An-Nisa about justice, is that the standard of justice is an absolute one. Listen to me, Muslims, and listen well. Your Islam is no good to you unless you can put it into action in times of crisis. Again, listen, Muslims. Your Islam is no good to you unless you can put into action in times of crisis. I mean, the reality is that all of us can be just and kind and all of these things when we're not having any difficulty. The real test, the real litmus test for whether or not La ilaha illallah Muhammadan Rasulullah means anything to us is when we are faced with a crisis that involves our family, that involves our kin, that involves loss of property, that involves loss of life. We know the Quran says that Shaitan threatens, the devil threatens us with loss of life, with loss of property, and the like. So if we understand this kind of situation, then we will put ourselves in a situation to say that we will stay close to the Quran, that we'll stay close to the Sunnah of Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, and that we will immerse ourselves in learning and application of the Quran and the Sunnah. So when we come up against these very, very difficult situations and find that we're tempted to lower our standard of justice, we won't do it. Because the fact of the matter is that the standard that Allah and His Messenger, that Allah gave us through His Messenger Muhammad, peace be upon him, and the standard that the messenger implemented consistently, consistently is the standard that we want to have that will improve the life for all human beings, whether they're our neighbors or not, whether they're Muslims or not, and it's a part of being a role model. Because oftentimes, if you study the biography of the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, that many people came to Islam by watching this standard of justice and understanding that this standard of justice was a part and parcel of what Islam was about, was a part and parcel about what La ilaha illallah, Muhammadur Rasulullah was all about. So in understanding that, we've set the context for understanding how it comes about that people get involved in the post-victimization ethical exemption syndrome. Okay, some background that might be useful in terms of talking about this concept. First, there's something called the post-traumatic stress disorder that many people develop in Vietnam, coming back during the war in Vietnam from the United States. When we come back after the break, we'll talk a little bit about that background and continue on talking about the post-victimization ethical exemption syndrome. We'll be right back after this break.